You seem to me to be a kind of vehement supporter of Russiagate. Your campaign contacted me, said they thought that was an unfair characterization. I went back and looked and concluded that at least it was excessive. And I went on the air a couple days later and kind of withdrew that characterization and said there's no need for me to kind of try and describe his views because he's going to be here and I can ask him. So here you are. In terms of this Russiagate narrative that really dominated our politics for 5 or 6 years, and the two prongs of it were that the Trump campaign collaborated with the Kremlin to hack into the DNC emails and manipulate the outcome of the 2016 election. And the subsidiary claim was that Trump was some sort of a puppet of Vladimir Putin or controlled by the Kremlin due to blackmail and other leverage. What is your view now about the veracity of those two claims?
Well, I think that there was a period, which you're correct about, that I just accepted the mainstream narrative. And, part of that is just my own fault of not being skeptical about it. And part of it also may have been just my natal, bias against Donald Trump, which I was like most Democrats, I was probably just happy to hear anything that confirmed my own notion of Donald Trump. The first time that I had any kind of inkling that that narrative may not be complete or accurate was when I was having dinner with Oliver Stone. And Oliver Stone lives about a half mile from where I live. And he had Cheryl and I for dinner one night, and with his son, Sean, who was a podcaster and a political critic. And it's the two of them. I don't know how it came up, but maybe one of us, Cheryl, I mentioned it, but he scoffed in a way that was very dismissive, and then had a sort of a brief dialogue about a brief monologue about how there was nothing to that story. And it seemed to me, of course, you're with Oliver Stone, so you think, well, he's a guy who's embracing fringe theories anyway, and you just don't know. But it put the first seed of doubt into my head. And then in 2020, when people started criticizing, including myself, the methodology that was being used to prove the COVID vaccines, I all of a sudden started seeing these propaganda tropes, or these tropes that were appearing all the time, saying anybody who criticizes vaccines is probably a Russian bot or a Russian stooge. So then I started saying, oh, okay, so here's what they're doing. And it may be orchestrated. And then I think at that point I was open to hearing a different story. And then I started seeing the piles of evidence, but I still was neutral on it. I mean, in my mind, the jury was out on this stuff until I saw, the recent disclosures, the Durham report, et cetera, that showed that that it makes it look like the entire thing was fabricated from a whole cloth.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I focused on it so much was not necessarily because I thought it was an unfair and baseless conspiracy theory that was being propagated by the U.S. security state and the corporate media, which I do think it was. I thought the much more important implication was it was essentially making it so that it was virtually criminalized, inherently so, for American officials to talk to Russian officials. Michael Flynn almost went to prison for calling the Russian ambassador to talk about U.S.-Russian relations. People were petrified of having conversations with Russians because of fear that it would be used to suggest they were sort of a Kremlin loyalist or a traitor. When I look now at the kind of fervor, the anti-Russian fervor that's driving the war in Ukraine, to me, a lot of it seems to have come from this kind of anti-Russian sentiment that Democrats in particular were encouraged to feed on for all these years as part of Russiagate, going back to 2016 when they blamed Russia rather than the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton for her defeat. I'm wondering if that's something that concerns you, this idea that so many Americans are being taught to view the Russians kind of the way we looked at them in the Cold War, as this grave existential threat to the United States, and that in part is what is driving what you described as this bellicose mindset toward Moscow.
The answer to your question is yes. Now I see in some way the Ukraine war, that I see a lot of those, that the Russian propaganda tropes that we were being force fed through the mainstream media, and always, with the sourced to a U.S. intelligence agent, an unnamed U.S. intelligence agency, which is always suspect. And usually coming out of the Washington Post and the New York Times, which, have these deep almost mockingbird-like relationships with the U.S. intelligence agencies. And now I see that as kind of the runway to the Ukraine war. That it was all, that we were being propagandized to see the Russians as an existential enemy.
Let me ask you about Ukraine, just one more question, which is, I've heard you before criticize President Biden the way a lot of people have, that it seems very striking. There's no effort, seemingly, to try and end this war diplomatically. If anything, there seems to be an attempt on the United States to block diplomatic efforts to end this war. Do you think it would have been possible to diplomatically avert the war beforehand or to end it now? And if so, how would you do that?
Yeah, I think it can be ended immediately. To me, it seems clear that Putin did not want this war, that he didn't, even when the Donbass voted 90-10 to join Russia, Putin didn't want them. Putin said, no, you stay in Ukraine. And then, he was part of the proposal of the Minsk Accords, which would have left Donbass part of Ukraine and, an autonomous region so that they could protect the Russian ethnic citizens who were then being murdered by the Azov battalion and by the Ukrainian government, and that they could continue to practice their own language and culture. And, but that, I think that's the basis for a peace agreement. And the key part of the Minsk Accords was that NATO would agree permanently, we are not going into the Ukraine, which is an understandable request from Russia, who has been invaded 3 times through the Ukraine. The last time in 41, 1 out of every 7 Russians was killed. And a third of the Russians Russia was reduced to rubble. So of course they don't want an enemy military in charge of the Ukraine. And they've made that clear since 1992, since they took the wall down. And the one request they made, they said, you can put NATO troops in United Germany. We will withdraw 400,000 troops from United Germany, but do not make us a promise. You will not move NATO to the east. And we promised them, we won't move it 1 inch to the east. Well, we moved it 1,000 miles to the east into 14 new countries. And now we've surrounded and encircled the Russians, and we're treating them like the enemy. And of course, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then, Glenn, the clear evidence that the United States was involved in the 2014 coup that removed Viktor Yanukovych's government, which is a government, Ukrainian government that was duly elected by the Ukrainian people, and that we regarded as too sympathetic to the government of Russia. And so, we pumped $5 billion into the project of overthrowing that government. And then we install our own government, which is Victoria Nuland, as we have her take on the phone, picking the new cabinet. And of course, the Russians aren't going to like that too much. Ukraine is 400 miles from Moscow. And we've already been installing missile systems, Aegis missile systems in Romania and Poland that are nuclear capable. When my uncle, in 1962, when the Russians did that to us in Cuba, we would have invaded them. So of course we would invade them today.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.